Good evening. Thanks for your patience. We had folks coming in planes, trains, and automobiles, so appreciate. I know we're starting a couple minutes late this evening. My name is Phoebe Stein, and I'm Executive Director of Maryland Humanities. And thanks for joining us tonight for the final program in what has been a new endeavor for our organization over the past 7 months. Is Justice Just? A series of discussions centering on an issue that greatly impacts our lives, reform of the United States criminal justice system. At Maryland Humanities, we're passionate about making the humanities part of our everyday lives. This evening's event exemplifies how we do this work. Programs like this one use the humanities to explore our ideas, our stories, and our values, to foster understanding among people with diverse perspectives, and to strengthen our ability to interact meaningfully with one another. We do our best work when we partner with individuals and institutions that help us highlight all that the humanities bring to our lives. And so I want to take a few moments to thank those who helped make tonight's event happen. Our thanks to the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation for their generous support, the Pulitzer Prizes for their partnership, and the Federation of State Humanities Councils, who made this work possible through their administration of the grants and programming that's taking place nationwide. We also want to thank the Venable Foundation and the Baltimore Bar Foundation for their support. We have local partners who I want to thank as well. Over the past few years, we've had the pleasure of working with the staff of the Baltimore Sun to provide local public programming focused on award-winning journalism, school segregation, and housing discrimination. We're pleased to be working with them again on this series. Choose Civility Howard County and the Maryland Institute College of Arts Curatorial MFA program have also partnered with us for this series, and we appreciate their support. I'd also like to thank the Maryland Humanities board members who are here this evening. They're very supportive of our work and all that we do to encourage community dialogue centered on important issues. I know it's dark in here, but if the Maryland Humanities board members could raise their hands and kind of wave them, just want to thank them very much for their service. Thank you. Finally, I want to recognize my Maryland Humanities colleagues who are here with me this evening, and especially Andrea Lewis and Teresa Warden for their hard and excellent work on this series. So if we could just pause for a moment before I introduce tonight's panelists, I'd like to ask everyone to pause and just check that your cell phones are silenced. Thank you, or on vibrate. So like many of you, the past couple of mornings I've woken up to I have a clock radio, and I woke up to the coverage of the furor over the most recent police-involved shooting in Charlotte, North Carolina. Every day, we seem to hear troubling reports about violent interactions between the public and the police. Some say our criminal justice system is one of the world's best, while others deem it completely broken. What we hope to do with our Is Justice Just series is spark discussion about some of the many challenges presented by the system of justice in this country so that you leave with much food for thought. Our panelists are here to offer their expertise on some of the local and national issues in policing. Dr. RaShall Brackney has retired as a 30-year veteran of the Pittsburgh Bureau of Police and served as the former chief of police of the George Washington University prior to her appointment as the chief of police for Charlottesville, Virginia in 2018. Dr. Brackney is a recognized expert in the areas of harm reduction, procedural and restorative justice practices, and community police relations. Due to her work in these areas, Dr. Brackney was selected by the Department of Justice to address bias-based and hate crimes reporting challenges in the nation. She earned her bachelor's and master's degree from Carnegie Mellon University and a PhD from Robert Morris University. Welcome.
Thank you.
Justin Fenton. Justin Fenton, who joined the Sun in 2005, has covered the Baltimore Police Department since 2008. His recent work includes coverage of the death of Freddie Gray and a series of articles on the Baltimore Police Department's Gun Trace Task Force. Welcome, Justin. Wesley Lowery is a Pulitzer Prize-winning national correspondent for the Washington Post who covers law enforcement, justice, and race. At the Post, he helps lead criminal justice data collection projects, including Fatal Force, an ongoing database tracking fatal police shootings and murder with impunity, which identified the neighborhoods in major American cities where homicides almost always go unsolved. His book, They Can't Kill Us All, Ferguson, Baltimore, and a New Era in America's Racial Justice Movement, examines, among other things, the cumulative effects of racially biased policing. Welcome. Rebecca Neusteter is an experienced researcher and practitioner in the field of criminal justice. She has implemented, managed, and evaluated various programs designed to improve the effectiveness of the criminal justice system and currently serves as the Vera Institute of Justice's Director of Policing. Previously, Rebecca served as Director of Research, Policy, and Planning for the New York Police Department, where she led the department's efforts to redesign the police officer performance evaluation system. Rebecca holds a PhD in criminal justice from John Jay College of the Graduate Center, City University of New York, an MS in urban policy analysis and management from the Milano Graduate School at New York University, and a BA in sociology from Chapman University. Welcome. Finally, our moderator for tonight is Andrew Green, opinion editor for the Baltimore Sun. He was a city-state editor before joining the editorial board, and prior to that, he covered the State House and Baltimore County government. Please help me welcome our distinguished panel. Thank you.
All right, good evening, everyone. Thanks for joining us. I'd like to start out the conversation tonight with my Sun colleague, Justin, to give us a little bit of the lay of the land locally here in Baltimore, and then we'll widen out to some national perspectives and bring the conversation together here. Obviously, a lot has happened in Baltimore in the last 4 years since the unrest after the death of Freddie Gray in regard to policing, the community's relationship with the police, efforts to reform the police department. And none of these issues were new at that point, but had been simmering, I think, for a long time before really exploding into the national view in a way they hadn't before. Can you bring us up to speed a little bit on some of the challenges that we have faced in the community in terms of effective policing, police reform, and the department's relationship with the community over the last 3 years? Big topic there.
I mean, I think one of the biggest challenges has been the complete turmoil at the top of the department. We have had, how many commissioners since then? Four commissioners. You know, the last commissioner was interim, and so he didn't have ownership of the department. There's been a tremendous amount of turnover. That continues. We have a new commissioner from New Orleans who has experience in internal affairs with a consent decree. He's come here with a lot of, I think he has a lot of support, I think. But he's, you know, right now we're seeing as he's trying to feel his way through this agency. Just this week, there's been a lot of commanders that have been relieved of duty or are going to be returning as lieutenants. And, you know, there's a question of, is he going to bring people from the outside? Who and you know, are they going to be here very long? Because you know, if he's not able to sort of get the stability that we've been looking for, we'll be right back to square one, trying to fill all these holes again. So I think you know, we're still trying to understand, you know, what the consent decree is going to be like. I think there's been this ramping up period that we're still in, and you know.
Yeah, and what has the impact of this this leadership vacuum been in the community? What difference does this make to people living in some of these areas of the city that have really struggled with crime, and particularly violent crime, for a long time?
I would say that probably it's hard to convince people that things are turning around when things are constantly changing and the department doesn't seem to have itself together. You know, it's hard to convince because people have heard these things over and over again over the years that change is coming. We're on top of this issue. This is real this time, and yet, you know, we kind of see the same things playing out. So, you know, I think everybody would like some stability, and then we have, of course, our problems at City Hall. City Hall is very unstable right now. The mayor's been on leave for what 4 weeks. So right. I think that it's hard to convey to people that we've got it this time when it's constantly in flux.
Yeah. Now, Wesley, you have covered a couple of related issues in a major way at the Post. You know, first, of course, the project for which you won the Pulitzer Prize a few years ago, in post-Ferguson, trying to catalog the police shootings, fatal police shootings across the country, which nobody was doing before. and looking at how that happens, why that happens, what happens after that. And then more recently, as Phoebe said, looking at the impact of this disconnect between police and the communities in terms of the effectiveness of police in solving crimes. How are these things related?
Sure, I think it's a really good question because I think that they are very intimately related. I think that very often, sometimes this conversation gets framed as a conversation that's about should there be more policing or less policing? And I think there is a conversation to be had about that. But when you spend time in the most heavily policed communities, those are communities very often that are asking for policing. Everyone wants to live in a community where they are safe. Everyone wants to live in a community where if they are the victim of a crime, they receive justice for that crime. And whether justice means getting their stolen car or TV back, or the person who assaulted them or murdered their loved one, going through the legal process and ultimately, being tried and convicted of a crime. But what we see very often is that we see very often in the most heavily policed communities where the conversations about things like stop, question, and frisk, about jump outs, about whether it be specialized task force, where the communities where those types of policing is actually playing out day in and day out, are also very often communities that have very low clearance rates for their most serious crimes. And so what happens as a result, and these also almost exclusively end up being low-income Black communities. And so what you end up seeing is a lot of low-income Black communities that feel as if they are harassed by the police, that they are being stopped and frisked, they're being kicked off of their stoop while they're listening to music, they're feeling harassed by police, their children have school resource officers and are interacting with the police. But then when those communities are victimized by crime, they don't feel like they're receiving adequate justice. People don't care about their murders. And then a police officer kills someone in their neighborhood, right? So much of the conversation we had about police use of force and about police violence happened just specifically about what actually ends up being one of the most rare instances in policing, the fatal use of fatal force and someone being killed. But that doesn't happen in a vacuum. It didn't happen in a vacuum here with Freddie Gray or Tyrone West. It didn't happen in a vacuum in Ferguson, Missouri, or Chicago or elsewhere. In each of these cases, you had pre-existing relationships that had been frayed to the extent they had ever existed. One thing I've said a lot as we've talked about our Murder with Impunity project is that when you think about a relationship can go sour in two different ways, right? My girlfriend can leave me because I cheat on her, and my girlfriend can also leave me because I forget her birthday, right? That a relationship.
I hope neither in your case.
Neither of those things, but the reality is, right, that a relationship can wither because of the presence of a negative, but also a failure to meet an expectation. And so much of our conversation about the relationship between communities and the police factors in the presence of the negative, the police shooting, the stop, question, and frisk, the drug policy, but very often doesn't consider the conversation we're also having about these are Americans who are entitled to justice and entitled to live in safe communities, and when the government fails to help provide that, it delegitimizes those police forces.
So in cities that you've reported on that have this problem of homicide being virtually legal in places because people never get held accountable for it, is it that the police are bad at their job? What's going on?
It's any number of things. But it creates a cycle of. Ultimately, what happens is you create a cycle of impunity. And so the things that factor, generally, every department looks different and operates different. Each homicide unit operates a little bit differently, and we spent time in a lot of them over the last 18 months or so. But generally, among the things that are present, one is that we still have a failure in a lot of departments to apply kind of the best practices of data and data analytics. In a lot of cases, you have, once a homicide is a calendar year old, you have almost no one looking at it or paying attention to it. In many cases, there are deep delays in the processing and in getting, whether it be gun ballistics or DNA, to crime labs, and that very often can hurt the likelihood that that evidence is usable when it's still actionable. Beyond that, in a lot of cases, you have departments that haven't prioritized the solving of the most egregious crimes, where there's a belief in parts of criminology that most homicides are solvable. Very few police officers get murdered and not have the person who kills them be arrested. Why? Because those become priority cases. Yeah. We see this very often in what the Chicago police call heater cases. When Dwayne Wade's cousin is shot and killed on the west side of Chicago in a neighborhood where homicides are never solved, well, guess what? That one got solved. But that also speaks to, in those cases that receive certain levels of media coverage, public outrage, the public is more likely to cooperate in those cases. That while there is certainly much more DNA and ballistic evidence than there was previously, most cases that result in arrest still have some type of human and witness component. Someone who is willing to tell the police what they saw, who they heard it was. And again, this is where these cycles come in. If a department in a certain neighborhood doesn't solve homicides, it disincentivizes people's willingness to participate in these investigations, which then makes it harder for them to solve homicides. And so it's a chicken and egg question, right? If you never solve any murders because no one will cooperate with you, well, how do you get them to cooperate by proving that you solve murders? Well, how do you figure that out? And so there's a lot of real difficulty there because again, the police do rely very heavily on the willingness of the community to participate in these investigations in order to make legitimate arrests.
Now, Rebecca, some of what Wesley was talking about connects, I think, very much with the work you do at the Vera Institute. Perhaps you could explain for a moment for the folks what the Vera Institute is and does, and then we can talk a little bit about the specific direction your role is taking it in with regard to some of the things that Wesley was talking about the police tactics that have this effect of alienating the community from the police.
Yeah, certainly. The Vera Institute of Justice was founded in the early 1960s and was originally established as a way to identify and solve problems within the criminal justice system. The very first project that the Vera Institute launched was in 1961, and it was called the Manhattan Bail Project. And our founder, a wonderful man by the name of Herb Sturz, had the opportunity to walk around a Manhattan jail that is commonly referred to as the Tombs. And he recognized conditions there that are not unlike conditions that are facing every jail across this country today, that many, many people, the vast majority of the people being held in that jail, were being held because they could not pay even nominal sums of money to be released on bail, sometimes $50, $100, $500. And so they sought to investigate whether or not money was actually a predictive factor in ensuring that people would return to court. And New York State is pretty exceptional historically in that bail is only a condition that can be set in order to ensure a person's appearance to court. It's not supposed to factor in dangerousness or anything of that fact because, of course, in our constitutions, people are presumed to be innocent until proven otherwise. And that research basically entailed finding out what was predictive to make people return to court. And it were obvious factors, whether or not people had a job, whether or not they had family ties, connections, resources, at that point, probably a quarter to ride the subway to get to the courts. Really just sort of basic life factors that had nothing to do with whether or not a person could pay for bail. And so in 1961, that basically set the stage for what we see today as release on recognizance, which is a practice in place in many courts all across the world, but still very much in debate and trying to be expanded in many places, including New York. Immediately after that project was launched and found to be successful, and those pretrial services were actually rolled out into citywide functions, Vera sought out to take on the Manhattan Summons Project and to try to understand if there were mechanisms that could be put in place to prevent an arrest in the first place, so rather than anybody even being taken to jail. And that was the Manhattan Summons Project that in 1963 established what we think is the very first summons in lieu of arrest program. And virtually every police department, I think, in the country and many across the world operates some sort of summons program. And from there, many other programs in all facets of the criminal justice and immigration system have taken foot. Our current vision is very values-driven, and we believe strongly that there is an urgent need to reform the criminal justice system in order to narrow the footprint that mass incarceration is one of the nation's largest problems and that we have an obligation to solve it. that we need to do that through data research, but also involving not just government, but community partners, and that we want to ensure equal access to justice for everyone, while at the same time engaging communities and families who are most impacted by the criminal justice and immigration systems and helping to develop those solutions. Our policing program is actually quite young. We've been doing policing work, as I mentioned, since the early 1960s, but it had been sort of a fabric and an outgrowth of other work that was happening at the Institute. And with this really targeted, precise organizational mission to end mass incarceration, our leadership recognized that there needed to be a portfolio and a mission around policing. So I started with the organization about 3 years ago in order to lead that work up, and it's been a real honor and delight, and some of my colleagues here are joining me this evening in this conversation. But ultimately, our mission is to end American policing's over-reliance on punitive enforcement. It doesn't sound like the sexiest topic, but we very much see, as Wes mentioned, these relatively rare but incredibly tragic outcomes as a symptom of a larger cultural problem within policing institutions that have, for the entirety of their existences, relied on enforcement in order to solve problems. And what we know is that enforcement doesn't solve problems and instead causes mass incarceration and causes really frayed and even toxic relationships between police and communities, particularly communities of color, who experience what Wes was describing as being simultaneously over and under policed. Minor transgressions being dealt with on an incredibly regular basis, fueling over 10 million arrests every single year. That equates to about every 3 seconds in this country somebody is arrested. The vast majority of these arrests are for incredibly low-level, trivial offenses, things that you would be surprised people are even being arrested for. Historically, for the past several decades, only less than 5% of arrests are for serious violent crimes, but we have this congestion of mass enforcement that's fueling our criminal justice system and tearing our communities apart.
Yeah, it reminds me what you're just saying there of, if you look at Freddie Gray's record before his final arrest, he had been arrested for, all kinds of petty crimes. One of his arrests was for playing dice, right? And I always thought, well, if I went out on my front porch and played dice, there is zero chance I would ever be arrested. But because he lived in one of these over-policed communities, that happened, and he gets cycled through the criminal justice system. And you're saying this is something you're seeing all over the place.
Yeah, all over the place, and I imagine everyone in the audience has seen this in their own communities or heard about it happening in other communities. That the challenge is that in cities that experience high levels of crime, there is an insistence to do something, and often that means police presence. And I don't think that police presence in and of itself is a bad thing. I think that there are wonderful police departments, wonderful police officers. The problem is that when you don't give officers tools to fundamentally solve problems and you're insisting that they make the problem go away, when the only tool available to them is to apply some sort of punitive enforcement, that has really detrimental effects. And I'd argue that those effects are applied much wider than to the individual who experiences it themselves. Entire communities and officers themselves have really, really adverse consequences and impacts of having to apply enforcement so broadly.
Now, we're very fortunate to have Chief Brackney here with us this evening. Speaking of the issue of seeking to change the culture of policing, that is the work you're engaged in right now. Can you tell us a little bit about how you came to Charlottesville, the problem you were sort of brought in to help address, what you found when you got there, and how you've been trying to proceed?
So thank you for having us, and thank you for being brave and courageous enough to have these types of conversations in the open and transparent. I arrived in Charlottesville approximately 10 months ago, and someone would say, why would you go to Charlottesville to be the chief of police after August of 2017, the Unite the Right rallies that have continued to put Charlottesville on the national stage each and every day? The short answer is, I say this over and over, that we were led there, but the long answer is that everything that I have done throughout my career had prepared me for times such as this. And Charlottesville, the reason I was specifically brought in is the tensions that existed within the community. There's this roiling of racism that was always under the surface, and it's kind of ironic, right? It's Jefferson, it's Madison, and it's all these other places that found the Constitution, and there's these tensions between these educational institutions and then Black community who just has had those institutions built on their backs. So there's conflict there. And then there's conflict between the policing community and the community that they serve. And it was so strained that literally within my first days there, I'm at a meet and greet, I'm walking down the street, and the community is following me, live streaming, and chanting at me, "Cops and Klan go hand in hand. Cops and Klan go hand in hand." And I was just really taken aback by just how forceful that was, and then had to think about what might that pain look like. And even more so, that they're chanting that to a woman who is an African-American woman in policing who has been victimized by these same social structures that they have been victimized by. So I was brought in to not, as I talk about police reform, we get off topic. We think about reforming the system in and of itself. We think about the policies. We think about the procedures. We think about the statutes that are there, and that there's this disproportionate way in which they're enforced, or disparate way in which they're enforced. And what I say is that's just a Band-Aid. I need to be able to go and change the culture of policing itself, so that when we look at another human being, we're empathetic in the way that we engage them. The reason that there is such animus and vitriol that's being spewed against the law enforcement profession right now is because of exactly the impunity in which we've operated in, and there's been no justice for anyone. I talk about to our officers, what is our social contract with the community? And the community has said to us, we will allow you to police us, but you have to do it fair and equitable. And if you fail to do that, we're going to respond. And when we don't respect that feeling, then the animus, the anger, the distrust continues. And more importantly, I ask them to just position yourself. Most of us have a contract to possibly have a roofer put our roof on. And if they don't live up to that expectation, and we have paid for them to do that, think of the lengths you go to get your $10,000 back or to have that contract enforced. Well, what might the community want to respond to if we've taken a life where they said, this is unjust, this is unfair? How might they respond when that type of contract has been broken? And it's getting the officers to think about it differently. And that's what the work is that I do and have done for years. And the reason you have low solvability rates, as we like to call it, or low clearance rates, is not because that there's not a willingness for the community to cooperate, but they don't trust the cooperation. And we expect more of the community than the law enforcement community expects of itself. When we have an officer who's corrupt, when we have an officer who has involved in a shooting that is a bad shooting, we never hear the law enforcement profession come out and say, I saw this, I witnessed this. But we want the community to say, I saw or witnessed an ill or harm in their own community. So there's an automatic lie that we operate under every single day, and there's no way we're going to get clearances in those communities because they don't trust us to police ourselves, let alone police their communities fair and equitably.
The issue of police policing themselves has obviously been a huge one here in Baltimore. You know, Justin, you've written a lot about the Gun Trace Task Force scandal here. Tell us a little bit about how you think that has impacted the community's view of the police. I ask you these like very easy, discrete questions.
Yeah, I mean, it's. I think, yeah, that's a very complicated question, but I think at its core, it exposed corruption that I think people who were speaking out said existed, that really had not been validated to that point, in the sense that, I mean, I've covered many cases over the 11 years I've covered the department of, there's an officer here who's stealing, there's an officer here who was assaulted someone, there's an officer here who is planting drugs. They were all. It was easy for the department to dismiss those as the bad apple defense, right, because they happened one at a time, and the dots were not being connected. And this case connected the dots. You had an entire squad that had gone rogue, and they weren't They didn't assault one person. They didn't plant drugs one time. This was a prolonged crime spree, basically.
An organized criminal enterprise, basically.
It was, and I think, I don't want to embarrass him, but one of the prosecutors in the audience, he had a great quote in that trial. He said, "This wasn't a group of officers who went rogue. They didn't come together and decide to start doing things. These were rogue officers who had been operating in this fashion for an extended period of time in different parts of the agency who, as far as we can tell, by chance came together and sort of formed almost this all-star group of officers." And the question is sort of, all-star in a bad way, obviously, the worst of the worst. And so the question is sort of like, what are the missed signs? What should have been known? What could have been known? And that's a really hard question. I think by its nature, that probably isn't something that's done overtly, just because anyone who's committing a crime is not going to broadcast it. That's simply not good for business. But surely, there are many people who knew something, who saw some degree of it. I'm interested in the fact that it's been said that there weren't very many complaints against the officers of that fashion, that they've admitted to dozens and dozens of robberies, and within their internal affairs files, there are very few complaints for that. And it speaks to sort of who they were targeting, what the expectation was for what would happen if they targeted those people, and sort of the disincentive for them to say anything. Because when you are charged with, when you do have drugs on you, you do have guns, perhaps, and some of that is taken, and your money's taken, and you know that the officers aren't telling the truth about what they took and how they got to your stuff in the first place. What is your incentive to stand up and say, I actually had more than that. I had far more drugs and they were stolen and resold in the streets. You're going to take the best deal you can. The officers want the case to go away as well. Everybody wants it to go away, and it stays buried. And it stayed buried until this wiretap investigation, which, quite frankly, the investigators sort of fell backwards into.
And notably, this was not a Baltimore City Police wiretap.
But the FBI task force that investigated it was comprised of Baltimore City officers, but interestingly, who are detailed to the FBI with really no contact with their agency, so that they can investigate these things. They have ownership of it to a degree. It was sort of hidden from their command, though. So they were part of bringing them down. Yeah, I mean, it's the more we find out about that case, it keeps going and going and going. It goes far back. It expands the number of people involved, the number of incidents. There's a universe of incidents involved in that case.
Yeah. Now, Chief Brackney, when we talked earlier, you were saying that when you came into Charlottesville, one of the things you did was to disband specialized units like the Gun Trace Task Force here. Tell us why you did that.
So the only pushback I would have is these are typically not a group of officers who just randomly come together. That often officers in these specialized units are identified by whatever values that police department places on certain behaviors, and then they're put in these different task force and these specialized groups. The first thing I did was decentralize these groups that have been centralized, these specialized groups, and the reason is you create this culture. You're insular from the rest of the policing community, and there's very little oversight. There's very little supervision. There's very little leadership there. There's very little accountability. And when you have that kind of autonomy, that group will then start reinforcing its own negative and or positive behaviors. And that could not, the relationship is so fragile that I could not risk that. So I disbanded everyone and brought those units back. Those ones who are on certain task force that do drug task force particularly are extremely vulnerable because of the fact you get involved in the work to such a degree in undercover work that crossing those lines become part of their narrative. So that was the first step that I took. And there was a lot of pushback in that they were saying that they thought that I thought they were doing things wrong. And here's what I said every single time, and this is my quote, and it's come back to haunt me, is that we are specialists, we aren't special. We do our jobs with integrity and excellence. And if you need to feel special, then you need to find another job. So I do a lot of that decentralization because when they are isolated, that's how you get it. And then you stay in these task force for years. I am now going to rotate everyone in and out 2 to 3 years. You cannot sit in a place for 5 and 10 years and then willingly, when you see your partner who you work with day in and day out, you're now going to the baptisms, the barbecues, the bat mitzvahs with each other, you're not going to tell when there's that kind of familiar relationship. So you have to kind of keep the organization nimble, flexible, so that they're always being moved in such a way that you disrupt that culture. The problem with what was occurring in DC, New Orleans, Miami, LA, all the research says you can't keep these specialized units together, and it's almost always out of those specialized units you'll see these very large-scale corruption.
And we'd had problems with specialized units like this in Baltimore for years. They came under different assorted names, but the Violent Crime Impact Division, the VCID, this has been a perennial problem for a long time. Now, Wes, have you seen in other cities? As you have looked at cases of police violence, have you been able to determine anything from that about the kinds of officers who are involved in these excessive force cases?
Yes and no. Once you start looking at data and information on the officers themselves, it becomes much more difficult to aggregate up because much less of that information is available. So for example, in about 20% of fatal force occurrences, the names of the officers involved have never been released publicly. That's nationally, right? And so you're already talking about a universe where you're beginning with 1 in 5 police shootings, you're not even allowed to know who the police officer was who shot and killed the person. And in some cases, that's full departments that have policies about that. In other cases, it's...
And how often do police not release the name of a citizen who shoots and kills someone?
Almost never.
Right.
The rare, on occasion a juvenile, but again, and you think about, and I think about that. I remember when I was at the Boston Globe covering both local politics, but also doing some police shifts, and I'll never forget one of the first officer-involved shootings I covered. A young, must have been a 16 or 17-year-old black man had been killed after he got pulled over. He'd run out of the car. They chased him into an alley. He turned around, and it was a waistband killing. He did have a gun, and so. But I remember the mother in that case showed up at these police town halls for months, going on years. The district attorney was still investigating the shooting, and because of that, no information had been released publicly. And I'll never forget her confronting the police superintendent at the time and saying, look, I can't even get on the train and see a police officer joking around with some school kids, and I'm thinking, is that the man who killed my son? Right? That as a person who, she was unquestionably a victim of this scenario, whether it was a justified shooting or an unjustified shooting. Her son had been killed by a police officer. And yet for her to be a citizen of the city, to be able to move at large, to go to work every day, right? She was being re-traumatized in part only by the lack of information, just literally not even knowing who it was, who had been involved. Beyond that, as we have done analysis of police officers who were involved in fatal shootings, what we've seen is that it does stretch across the profession, right? That we've seen that it's about 60-40 patrol officers versus specialized units in terms of people who are committing, fatal shootings. That it's not all rookies and it's not all veteran officers. There's a mixture across the years on the force. That while police very often like to employ the kind of discussion around, most officers never discharge their weapon, which is probably statistically true. 1 in 6 fatal police shootings is committed by an officer who has previously shot and killed someone, right? And so every single year you have dozens of police officers killing not the first person who they have killed, and which raises a host of questions, not just about why is there a small section of officers who are committing a disproportionate amount of these killings, but also what type of treatment for the trauma of being involved in a fatal shooting in the first place did they receive? How long were they out? When did they come back on the job? Where were these specific officers trained versus other officers, right? And so there's a whole host of questions. But again, there's a real difficulty. One of the places in the last decade or 2 decades that the police across the country have been able to consolidate power has been via their union contracts. And that, and it's a bit of an oversimplified narrative, but as we went through recessions and economic downturns where you had municipalities who were unable to give their officers raises, unions were able to extract other concessions. We've seen these police officer Bill of Rights in dozens of states. But
Maryland included.
Maryland included. And that starts to factor in not just in terms of how these fatal shootings themselves are dispensed of. So in many cases you have the implication of the so-called 48-hour rule, where a police officer involved in a fatal shooting cannot even be interviewed for the first 48 hours after the police shooting, based on debunked science that your memory is best after 2 REM cycles. Well, that's nonsensical, right? If I pull a gun out and kill Justin right now, I'm not going to go, listen, officer, you can interview me in 48 hours. I need 2 REM cycles to remember what happened.
And the officers would never go for that.
Of course not. But in the meantime, I'm going to talk to everyone else who was in the room, and we're going to have our shared attorney, and we're going to provide, and in many places, it's built into these Bill of Rights. It's not even 48 hours. In some cases, it's a full 7 days, a full week. And again, that's something that begins to tear at some of the social contract. Beyond that, we did a project in 2017, Fired, Rehired, where we looked at. We said, all right, so police departments and chiefs across the country are telling us that even those who agree that there are systemic problems, everyone says, look, there are bad apple police officers. There are bad cops, and we want to get rid of them. In the same way, there are bad journalists, and you want to get rid of them. And they're bad. Okay, and so we said, so what happens? And I can name names later, and we can.
Compare notes. Right.
But we said, all right, so what happens when a police chief decides to fire a police officer, right? Everyone agrees they're a bad apple, so when you fire a police officer, what happens? And what happens more often than not is that police officer gets their job back via arbitration. And this is an extremely self-selecting group of people. These are police officers fired by a police chief, and the majority of them receive their jobs back. Yeah. And so it speaks again to a system that in so many systemic ways, it's not even about individual decision makers, in so many systemic ways, is tilted away from a transparency and an accountability, and people in communities perceive that and they see that over time. Whether they can articulate it fully or not, people understand that there used to be this protest chant during Ferguson and elsewhere, the whole damn system is guilty as hell, right? This idea that we don't even know what's going to happen here, but we know what's going to happen here. They're going to let this guy off. And we could cross the T's and dot the I's about how exactly that might happen, but after years of people living that experience, it has really started to erode a lot of these community relationships.
Yeah, we just had an example in Maryland, similar to what you're saying about the fired and rehired of a police officer who was fired from a department in Delaware after being sued for an excessive force complaint. They settled. He lost his job. He was hired into a small department in southern Eastern Shore and was then involved in the death of a teenager named Anton Black in pretty questionable circumstances that got attention all the way up to the governor here. But that happened. It happened right here. Yeah.
Well, and we've seen, the officer involved in this is playing out still in my hometown of Cleveland, where the officer involved in the death of Tamir Rice, Timothy Lohman, has been appealing through arbitration, and in the meantime had gotten hired by 2 separate other police departments, right? And so this is in one of the most emotionally charged and perhaps questionable cases of the last few years. But again, the way these mechanisms work is that what we found was that in many states, it's very easy for an officer, no matter how they've been discharged from their previous job, to easily transition, especially into a smaller police department. And so you see this happening hundreds, if not thousands of times a year as officers move from place to place. And that's even after, and that's assuming they don't get their literal same job back. Because that, like I said, 6 in 10 police officers fired by a major police department get their job back, much less having to go elsewhere.
Yeah. Now, Rebecca, when we were talking earlier, we were discussing not some of these kind of extraordinary things that caused rifts between the community, not something big like the Gun Trace Task Force or something big like a shooting, but the day-to-day interactions in a lot of cities, the stop and frisks, the petty arrests. What have you found about what drives the culture that leads departments to operating in that way? What is it that has gotten us to that point?
Well, a couple of thoughts. First and foremost, there are very few professions in which you have less interaction with your direct supervisors and the people who will hold you accountable than being a police officer, particularly for people who are so young and largely men. And so there definitely is a culture of not being paid attention to, having a lot of power at your disposal, and in instances knowing who's not going to complain plane when you do something that you're not supposed to do. So that's a major, major issue, and I think that nationally and internationally, we've really looked towards body-worn cameras and things like that in order to create sort of a better spotlight on people's behaviors and how they're interacting with individuals in the community. But I just want to highlight a couple other things. I mean, first and foremost, it's incredibly difficult to be a police chief, particularly when you try to dismiss employees who are doing a bad thing and don't have the power to do that, and being misunderstood by the community that you have the intention of trying to clean up your department and don't have the power to do so. So I would love to see more engaged conversations around the country where communities truly understand the powers and the lack of powers that police chiefs have, because in fact, in many communities, communities hold the power to ensure that this changes at least systemically in ways that many police chiefs themselves don't in the immediate term actually have at their disposal. So I think that's just like a really important thing for folks to understand, because it is oftentimes looked at the police department and the police chief as a failure on their part, which I think the statistics that Wes mentioned demonstrates that that's at least not universally the challenge. But then turning to sort of the broader culture, and with the exception to these task forces that RaShall mentioned, the anti-crime task forces is what I'm most used to hearing them called, who tend to be filled with people who have been very productive officers. And in policing language, what that means is that they've made a lot of arrests and issued a lot of summonses, applied a lot of punitive enforcement over the course of their career. And then they end up in what are these sort of choice assignments, and they are proactive. They are very active on the streets. But by and large, most police officers just aren't actually that proactive. The vast majority of their time is spent responding to 911 calls. And what we really, I think, need to do is to fundamentally understand how calls for service are coming in, how communities are demanding and asking for help when they have no one else to call, even when the relationships between the community and the police department are failed, and how we fail them in those communications and dispatch delivery systems. So turning to the Tamir Rice case, for example, awful, awful case for so many reasons, but starting at the time of the 911 call. You have a community member who was concerned that perhaps somebody had a gun in the park, but expressed, I think, at least three times, maybe as many as 4 times in the course of this short 911 call, that he thought that the gun was probably fake. That information was not transmitted to the officers. And so you quite literally have a game of telephone when you call 911. There are multiple people. There's a call operator, there's a dispatcher, there's a police officer, there may be other people involved in these conversations. They're totally antiquated, really, really poor systems, not set up to really capture information in a way that's useful for officers that need to make split-second decisions. I have no way, none of us have any way to go to the counterfactual of that Tamir Rice case to see what the officers would have done should that information that maybe this gun wasn't real been imparted to them. But I think we all need to ask that question and start to understand what information is available to officers at their disposal. And that's not just a policing problem. 911 systems are typically not operated by police departments. They're communication centers, oftentimes regional community communication centers that are operating for public safety broadly, but are not being examined, not being resourced whatsoever. In fact, many of the 911 surcharges that are taken from your cell phone to pay for communication centers, many states, including Maryland recently, are taking those revenues out and using them for different things. So I think that it's really important to be paying very close attention to why people are calling the police and how that information is being imparted and how it can be best used to make decisions in really hard circumstances.
Right, and are police really necessarily the right people or the right agency to be responding to some of the things people call 911 for?
I think often not. That unfortunately there are no national data on 911 operations. We're running a study right now where we're even just trying to document the process for which a call comes in and how it's handled and how it's delivered. And there's not a resource that we know of that exists to that extent at this point. What we do know from the National Emergency Network Administration is that there's upwards conservatively of about 250 million calls that are made to the police every single year. We don't know what those calls are for, but in looking at a handful of sample jurisdictions that we have access to through research, or because increasingly lots of jurisdictions, I think Charlottesville being one, are starting to open their data up, make it available for folks to look at, it appears as though it's less than a third, usually about 20% of those calls that have anything to do with the crime at all.
Now, Chief Brackney, Rebecca was mentioning a minute ago how often police officers get incentivized to make citations, to make arrests, to do stop and frisks, to do these intrusive kinds of policing. How do you create an incentive that operates differently? How do you create a culture where people are being recognized for doing their job in a different way that has less of a negative effect on community relations?
So it's just like any other rewarded behavior, right? People will do what they're incentivized to do or disincentivized to do. And the first thing, the most interesting thing that I did when I first arrived in Charlottesville was, as we spoke briefly, I had all of my officers perform a SWOT analysis, and I gave them all Strength Finders 2.0. It was met with the craziest resistance. And then when I was asking them what their strengths were and their weaknesses and the opportunities for the agency and the threats to the agency, no one had ever asked them. So what I was doing at that point was identifying their knowledge, their skills, and abilities they had to match those with the needs of the organization. So I took a business model approach to it so that I didn't have someone operating in an area that they were being forced to write tickets or to arrest people to be recognized and operate in their strengths. So if we find out that their strengths are things like communication, leadership, creativity, then you put them in the positions that allow them to flourish, and then that's not necessarily the ones that are answering the 911 calls. So you have to look at it differently. Also, too, is you can't use those kinds of statistics for your promotional opportunities. If you're saying that the number of tickets that you've written, that you're using a zero tolerance policy, which is words you hear oftentimes, zero tolerance enforcement strategies, that often just adds another tick mark to either an arrest, summons, an investigative detention. I don't use the word stop and frisk intentionally, and my officers don't, and now they don't use it in Charlottesville. They ask, what are your stop and frisk statistics? And I said, we don't do stop and frisk here, because if we were doing stop and frisk, we're not doing our jobs. We engage people, we encounter people, and if you change the language, the officers then start behaving the way the language is. And that's what's so interesting about it. And the way that also you get changes in behavior is transparency. I've been there 10 months. I've released all arrest data for the last 5 years in Charlottesville. I've posted since 17 and 18, every complaint that has come in against the officers, the date it came in, the date it was closed, the nature of the complaint, and whether we sustained it. And so that's all now for 2017 and 2018. I now put every use of force incident on our website. I say when it occurred, the date it occurred, the level of force used, and a scenario around it, so that they can see what type of force we're employing when we're encountering individuals. And in some ways, if the officers are trending in a certain way, and you now know your data is going to be posted up there, I kind of think of it like Catholic school tithing. If you know when your money's being put up there, you start to tithe more. Well, if that changes behavior, then that changes behavior. So it's a different strategy and approach, but also, too, it's a very strong message from the top where I've said to them, if this is not the type of law enforcement that you would like to engage in, policing you would like to engage in, feel free to go to another place. And you can be hired there. You're not welcomed here. We don't keep people in our house that we don't get along with. And that's just as simple as that.
Here in Baltimore, there's been a lot of debate over the years about use of CompStat. You know, we were sort of an early adopter of that after New York under the O'Malley administration, and you know, the focus on statistics, on putting up numbers. This came up a lot in the DOJ report about the Baltimore Police Department. You know, tell us a little bit about how that culture developed here and how it's continued or hasn't in the last few years.
Yeah, we have a habit here of adopting things that have worked in other cities or appear to have worked in other cities, and they don't work here. We had CompStat.
It turns out maybe they don't work in the other cities either.
Yeah, I mean, you know,
They didn't work in New York either.
Our mayor at the time saw the crime declines in New York City, and he wanted that here, and he imported the actual architects of that strategy to come set it up here, and we imported commanders from New York City to implement it, and you know, we saw crime declines, but we also saw a tremendous amount of strain with the community, and eventually those crime declines leveled off and started to come back up, and people continually to this day point to that time period as really being a very destructive time period in police-community relations. In the subsequent administration, CompStat was seen as less about stats, more about accountability. And the people who were there at that time will say, we were holding people accountable. Well, over time, we have learned that sort of, they were holding people accountable, but they were also encouraging a very sort of brutal attitude while arrests went down and crime went down as well. We saw fewer than 200 homicides for the first time in 30 years, right. But it took some years for it to really settle in, I think, in the broad consciousness that they had a very brutal attitude, and the officers from the Gun Trace Task Force, the seeds were planted during that period, I believe, where those officers learned that, you know, being tough was the most important thing. I think it's interesting we talk about. I just lost my train of thought. but sort of. Okay. We're talking about the police-involved shootings. Way before Ferguson, way before there was a major conversation in the national discourse about police-involved shootings, and here they were releasing the names of officers who shot people, and they tried to stop. And for a period of time, they did stop releasing the names. And then I remember I went to a police awards ceremony, which was open to the public, and everybody who. Most of the people who got awards had shot somebody. They didn't want to tell the public who had shot people, and yet those were the people that were getting Bronze Stars, Silver Stars, Medal of Honor. It was this dichotomy where, you know, they were encouraging it within the department, and they knew outside that it was trouble, and that they didn't want to open that up. So as far as CompStat, I think. Just to answer the question, I think we did get away from the CompStat philosophy when it works, which is to, you know, check on things, be accountable. You see the overtime abuse that's been going on. You know, how can it be that people are in Myrtle Beach and earning overtime? Right. People aren't checking, and I think to a certain extent we need to re-implement those systems, but not with the emphasis on productivity, stats, things like that. And
as the DOJ report said, there's this whole generation of what became mid-level commanders in the time period they were looking at, people who had kind of cut their teeth under the zero-tolerance policies in Baltimore and now were sergeants, or, you know, now in a little bit of a higher capacity, who were still kind of driving this culture in the department and you know, seeing policing, effective policing as being, you know, putting up numbers, clearing corners. You know, there were cases where the DOJ inspectors were like literally in the car with Baltimore police officers when the call came out, you know, you just need to make some arrests and you clear some corners.
And they'll say that they believe they were saving lives. They say that people on a corner is trouble. You know, that if there's a lot of people on a corner and someone comes up and starts shooting up the block, that's you know, 12 shooting victims. But, you know, if you're in the position of someone who is merely enjoying the nice weather and trying to have a good time, mm-hmm. and you're told, go inside because we don't want you to get shot, you know, that's sort of a tough sell, and they're trying to get them to stop doing that. But I continue to hear from officers who say, that's going to be a problem. If we aren't able to do that, there's going to be problems. And this current chief is trying to tell the officers, we can do this constitutionally. It can be done, and there's a culture change going on, an attempted culture change.
Yeah, I mean, I think an interesting side note back to the Freddie Gray case is He was in an area that was getting special enforcement emphasis because the state's attorney had written to the Western District Commander, I think, and said, hey, there's this one spot where I'm hearing complaints. And this got translated down the command chain to show me some deliverables, meaning make some stops, make some arrests. And
their strategy over the years was stop people for minor offenses and flip them. Take them to the station, squeeze them, ask them what information they have. And this was seen as a good way of policing.
Yeah.
And that's why officers now who are from the old school of doing these are like, what are we supposed to do? If we can't stop somebody for, jaywalking or whatever, how are we going to get informants? How are we going to solve murders if we aren't able to pull people in on minor offenses? I think that's an interesting component of your series is sort of, I spent some time embedded on a single case in the Baltimore Homicide Unit in 2015, and they had no tips whatsoever from the community. And they very much saw, they did the following to solve the case. They squeezed people, they listened to jail calls. That's the only thing that they felt like, the only tool they felt like they had in their toolbox.
right, and you describe scenes where they would bring someone in to try to get him to be a witness, and he said basically like, look, you guys are not going to solve this, if I'm remembering correctly, and I'm going to still be out there, and I'm going to be high and dry.
Well, there's a very chilling line for a number of reasons. There was a witness who was in the witness box, and he said the victim is looking down on me right now, and he doesn't want me to say anything. Like, he does not want me to help you solve this case. And the officers are like, what are we supposed to do about that? But it goes back to, again, I do think, even though he didn't express it verbally, that it's about, not only do I not want to get involved in this, but yes, I don't want to put myself out there. You aren't going to be there for me. My neighborhood sees shootings. The police cannot save me. I'm going to put myself out there. It's a very, think about it. If you witnessed a crime and the idea that you're going to put yourself out there, take the stand, point the finger, and go back to that community or leave that community, not be able to go to your home, that's a tough sell. And I don't think that's going to be changed anytime soon, because that's human nature.
Yeah. And so, Wes, this is not just a Baltimore problem.
No, certainly not at all. One thing that occurred to me as we were talking, was even beyond the kind of generation of command staff in police departments across the country who came up during kind of the zero tolerance and CompStat era. Those are also officers who were trained under training curriculums that were developed in the 90s during the crime wave freakout. Mm-hmm. And I think that and a lot of these actual training videos are available like on YouTube, and they're horrifying. When you watch the actual curriculum by which, if you are someone who's been a police officer at this point for 25 or 30 years, the actual curriculum by which you were trained certainly doesn't comport with what we might want our standards today to be, right? And I think that's something that we don't even necessarily think about is how the actual, what mathematics and literature are our police officers being taught, right? And what have we learned in the 25 years since the 90s, since the crime bill, that we might now need to not only implement into curriculums, but also reteach the people who are now running departments. But beyond that, and I do think for folks who haven't read, if you haven't read Justin's work on this specific issue, you definitely should, because it was really moving. But we looked at this across a few different cities as well, and I think very often about a piece we did in Richmond, Virginia, which has a very high homicide arrest rate. And we did a piece about a witness, about a man, Kenneth Moore, who had witnessed a homicide in the public housing complex where he lived, and his decision about whether or not he would cooperate, and trying to get at this idea of, you're just going about your life, right? It's a Saturday, it's a Thursday night, you're bringing the groceries, him and his wife are bringing the groceries inside, he's sitting in his car, and you watch something that has nothing to do with you play out in front of you. But now every decision you make could impact the rest of your life, And so what we did, this was a case that had already been all the way adjudicated, and we went back and, using both the documents and also with him on the record, recreated what this process was for him. He watches a homicide happen on his street, and now he has to decide, well, if I cooperate, this could, people are going to know who I am, right? And it's not even going to trial. He has to make the decision when the cops show up at his door. Does he admit that he saw anything? Does he direct them towards where the shell casings might be, or does he not? And as he's making these crucial decisions that are the difference between an innocent woman who's been gunned down and her family receiving justice or not. He's in real time having to think, well, is anyone seeing this police officer standing at my doorstep? Can the neighbors through the wall hear what I'm saying? Do people, now it's been 30, 45 seconds, that people are gonna know I didn't tell these guys to go screw up. The process of what happens there. Kenneth in that story ultimately does cooperate. Him and his wife do tell the police what they saw. They do take the stand. They end up being the witnesses that help secure the arrest of the person believed to have committed this murder. And then they're retaliated against and have to move across the state, right? And it speaks to the very real human cost of especially when you live in a neighborhood or an area with violence and in a community, the real potential cost of cooperation. And I think sometimes we don't fully in our dialogue appreciate that, right? That you're existing in a space where murder is frequent, where shootings are frequent, where they happen all the time, where there's almost never justice, but now you know that even cooperating could mean you have to move away or worse. And what we're asking of people when we say that, it's very, we often hear, especially in the online comments or the emails or in the dialogue, right, well, it's about a stop snitching culture, and all these things are not untrue. Right? But I think that we miss sometimes the complexity and the nuance and the difficulty of, well, what happened what would happen if you watched a homicide happen outside of your home and you knew that cooperating with the police would mean you and your family need to leave where you live and could probably never come back? How would that change all of our calculuses in terms of how we think of other people's willingness to cooperate or not?
Yeah. Getting back to the Comstat issue for a second here, Rebecca, one of the things you work on is trying to find like a 2.0 version of this, right? A better way to use statistics in policing. Can you tell us a little bit about how that might work?
Yeah, in partnership with the National Police Foundation, Vera has launched an initiative that initially was called Comstat 2.0, and then we've since renamed it to Comstat 360. For a couple of really intentional reasons, as RaShall and others have said, language really matters, and 2.0 sort of connotes that you're not quite done, and you're beta testing the version. But the intention of Comstat 2.0 now, Comstat 360, was really to harness the positive attributes of Comstat, which I would argue there are some, and I actually don't think Comstat failed. I think Comstat highly succeeded at what it intended to do. And the problem with Comstat, and it's the same problem in managing any kind of crisis or problem, is if you're not really intentional about defining the problem and how you want to see the outcome changed, then it's completely subjective later on. I don't think that was exactly the case here. I think that the NYPD, and in full disclosure, the Vera Institute was involved in developing the original version of Comstat. They intentionally wanted to make a major impact on violent crime and made a decision to do that at sparing absolutely no cost at all. And that was achieved to a T. But what happened was a complete neglect of trying to involve other people who are affected by violent crime and understanding what was important to them and how did they define success. And so for the past couple of decades, as Comstat has operated in its area and been replicated and adopted by, we know, at least about 60% of the police departments in the United States and many abroad, is that there were competing efforts, mostly under the umbrella of community policing. And historically, community policing and Comstat have been thought of as these dialectical at odds kinds of initiatives. And what we wanted to do is we wanted to harness the accountability, the precision around definitions, the really sort of understanding in real time what the problems are, benefits from Comstat, but to apply them in a much more holistic way. And initially what we thought that meant was to make sure that communities were involved in defining what success actually meant, and then participating in the input of that data in order to understand whether or not progress was being achieved in the desired directions. And that was sort of the CompStat 2.0 version, where it was crime and community trying to live together in some sort of management and performance framework. What we recognized as we were rolling this out is that there are fundamentally a lot of cultural problems, training problems, access problems in police departments that hinder the ability to actually make that work. And so CompStat 360 intentionally builds in an organizational effectiveness element that tries to assess whether or not the sort of health and priority of the people who are working in the organization is being monitored and managed. Because if it's not, it doesn't really matter what's happening on the outside. If officers don't feel like they're being treated respectfully, that they have access to the training and the tools and the skills that they need, they're not going to have positive interactions with the community. And unless we think about community interaction, community agencies, officers, the workforce, beyond sworn, but also civilian and many other people that work in departments, all in tandem with public safety, not just the problems that have already happened, but the need to prevent additional crime. Without the understanding that these three things all need to be examined in direct effect with one another, then you create blind spots. And the New York City and Baltimore CompStat experiences are exactly indicative of that. You know, you had some gains in public safety, but at a major expense to communities that will be repairing for generations.
Chief Brackney, Justin alluded to this earlier, that this kind of sense that we've seen in Baltimore among police saying, like, look, we can either, what you're asking us to do is to not be police, right? That we can either do this constitutional policing thing, or we can stop crime, that you can't do both things. And there's been a lot of resistance to this notion. Our new police chief, Michael Harrison, is trying to say, no, look, I've seen this done, this can be done. How can it be done? How do you create this culture, this new sense of mission in a police department?
So the first thing is you have to be very clear about what you're valuing. And I guess for me the rub is when you say, oh, we want to do this constitutional policing thing. The fact that we're even having that conversation is really scary. So the first thing I would say, even as advice to, a newly appointed chief, is something that I experienced in Pittsburgh and spent a lot of time serving communities that had high crime, often minority, low income, low wealth communities, low services, food deserts, educational deserts, recreational deserts, any kind of other desert, housing deficiencies that existed. And they were being policed by officers who probably had every ism connected to their last names, right? So what I mean by that is, policing is 70% white male right off the bat. And then that means you've got 30% that can be African-American males, white females, black females, etc. And what we have done is we've always assumed that the communities that we're engaging know the policing culture and know the policing community and what we value. And then as police, we seem to assume what the community values, right? We say things like, oh, you must want us to solve this crime. And that may not be it. So the way that you change that and the way you get the numbers as well as the engagement is to do this. And I've done this in every community. It's been amazingly successful, is I go out and survey the community and I ask the community to tell me what they value. Tell me the types of crime that if we removed 3 homes off of this block, or we could bring people into the social norms of that community, that there wasn't terror being poured upon in that community. What might we do to solve that? And intrinsically, what are those resources that the community has without additional policing could we use to solve that? So the first thing I have is community buy-in, because they've told me what the issue is. I've not gone in, as government always does, and tell them what the issue is. And then the second part is we're using resources within the community versus government, because we are tired of waiting for Superman not coming. So at this point, we need to use whatever we have within the community to help solve that issue. And that's the first thing I would say to him. When you start taking and having to think about the constitutionality of how we police,
that is the most outrageous thing I've even just heard, especially coming from New Orleans, who is currently under consent decree,
Right.
should have been under consent decree, where the officers were committing homicides, robberies, thefts intentionally.
Yeah,
So,
which, to his credit, he doesn't shy away from. He's an old internal affairs guy, so he.
yeah,
You're right.
that's interesting because it was really the internal affairs team, if you look at it, that were clearing their officers. So, if we talk about how do we do this better, we have to drop every tagline. We have to drop every data point that we want to check to cover our rear ends. And when I say, do we do community policing? I don't do community policing. I'm straightforward with it. And the reason I don't, because then it allows me to hide behind some process or some system that doesn't hold every officer accountable for how they engage every single day, every single action. Community policing has allowed policing to hide under a new umbrella, whether it's
Well,
problem
like
solving or whatever.
The thing you say about language, it's if you label it community policing, it implies that there is or should be a different kind.
That's right. So I go on, what are my everyday interactions look like with the community that I serve? And that's what we're here to do. We are a service and should be a service-oriented profession. And I struggle with whether, when I hear law enforcement is one component of the policing community. And the fact that we hold on to that oftentimes gives authority where we should not have any.
Justin, is our consent decree going to get us that?
No. Oh, sorry, Justin. Sorry.
No, I mean, the process, I have not been covering that aspect of I've been working on a series about the gun trace task force. It's going to come out in about a month, and I have not been covering the consent decree closely, but I think as an observer, I still don't really know what it's about, and I know that it's very much about process, and there's a lot of criticism about a lot of people getting paid a lot of money to come in here and implement new rules that may not be different than things we've seen in the past. But again, I think there's a template though where people say these have worked in other cities, and we're still in the ramping up period, and we'll see what happens.
Yeah. Wes, where is this being done well nationwide?
I think that there's I think there are best practices in various departments where that can be adapted. And I think that one of the challenges facing policing broadly is that, we in this nation police at a local level, right? It's an old federalism issue, right? And it creates a difficulty because it means that when a police department figures something out, that lesson has to be learned 18,000 additional times. That unlike many other industries, there can be a real delay in the dissemination and then the spread of best practices, and those best practices are then party and subject to the local politics of 18,000 different localities, right? Example of that I think about often is that I want to say it was 1976, the New York Police Department did a review of its fatal shootings. It had a large number of uses of force that year. It shot and killed a number of people, including a number of innocent bystanders. They conducted a review where they concluded that the leading circumstance in which officers were deploying deadly force were in car chases, that people would commit a crime, they'd jump in a car, they'd try to drive away, and the officers would open fire on the car. Well, in the absolute best case scenario, one officer fires one bullet and strikes the driver, incapacitating them, and the driver, as in their final moments, takes their foot off the gas and puts it on the brake, and the car coasts to a stop.
Puts it in park. And,
correct, right? And then they can effect an arrest, and well, in reality, you would very often have police officers surrounding a vehicle. All of them are opening fire from different angles, in fact, shooting each other, or the brownstones behind them, or the kids playing double dutch, or the passenger in the car who is not a party to whatever the crime that has allegedly been committed or not. And then, if the driver is incapacitated, you now have a 2-ton speeding bullet flying down a New York street, running over the kids playing double dutch or running into the brownstone, right? So the New York Police Department made a policy change. They banned all NYPD officers from shooting at moving vehicles. They're like, write the guy's license plate number down. We'll go find him. And they saw a massive decrease. They went from killing in the 3 digits numbers of people to shooting and killing a dozen people a year, perhaps. In 2015, the Denver police chief decided that after several controversial police shootings including 2 or 3 that involved a subject who was in a moving vehicle, that he was going to try to change the Denver police policy. And the local union ran him out of town. They said, why do you hate cops? Why do you want more cops dead? This was something that NYPD, while certainly not a perfect department, one of the most professionalized police departments in the country, had adopted decades ago, had documented a clear and obvious way for us to kill fewer people, including other police officers, because now we're not accidentally shooting each other. And yet, decades later, you have a police chief who essentially loses his job over trying to adopt a best practice that had been proven decades in advance, right? And so it speaks to some of the difficulty of taking these steps, is that you have to deal with these localized politics in so many different places. When so when you look at some of this stuff, right? I think you talk about policies like not shooting at moving vehicles is something that's been proven to limit the number of fatal encounters. High-end CIT training, crisis intervention training around mental illness, and in fact, some departments that are pioneering teams where officers are not the first responders to cases where someone is calling with mental illness is something that I think is potentially crucial. Interrogating the training, we talked earlier about the 48-hour rule. There's another one of my favorites is the 21-foot rule, which is, again, made up police science, is not real, but that suggests that someone with an edged weapon, a knife, a club, is an imminent lethal threat to you within 21 feet, and you are therefore justified in opening fire, which many police chiefs worry, and police trainers worry, incentivizes officers to basically draw an imaginary red line in the sand and open fire, as opposed to doing something
with their
like
precise laser vision of
course,
what 21 feet
yes.
is.
And then when being interviewed later, of course, it is, well, I was aware that he was about 21 feet away from me, and therefore, as opposed to taking perhaps one step backwards, and now you're 22 feet away. And so I think that there's something to be said about how we think about what a police officer is. I remember when we did our Fatal Force project, one of the first quotes from a chief was that he was talking about how very often we don't teach our officers that they can take one step backwards, and how many of these incidents could be changed.
Right, or that it's like a sign of weakness or something.
Correct.
Yeah.
And that I remember Ron Davis, who ran the cops office at DOJ, talking to us about, he goes, so often we chase the guy 4 blocks, jump over a fence, land on top of him, the gun falls out, and now we got to kill him, right? And what if we had just not jumped over the fence? What if we just waited at his house for him to come home? And I think there's some thought, and I think there's a lot of thought happening around policing about that. I was thinking earlier, and then I'll shut up. I was thinking earlier about, as part of this conversation, about something I think about very often with the Eric Gardner case in New York, which is up for administrative trial next month.
After how many is what?
5 years.
5 years,
5
yeah.
years.
And I think maybe it was Jelani Cobb in the New Yorker, but someone wrote, I don't want to claim credit for this idea, but someone once wrote that that Eric Gardner should have been the best friend of the officers who ultimately kill him. Here's a man who stands outside of the convenience store all day, every day, knows every single person in the community, witnesses every little petty crime that happens, and instead of being the best source for these officers, who, by the way, were responding to a call for a fight that Eric Gardner had helped break up, he ends up dead on the sidewalk, right? And it speaks to, how are we incentivizing these interactions? These are officers who've been called out to a scene, and as far as we're aware, had perceived that their mandate in this context was to effectuate an arrest. And Eric Gardner became the person who they needed to arrest suddenly, as opposed to being...
Because he was there.
Because he was there. Again, as opposed to being someone who should be their most crucial source. The guy who stands around all day and sees everything is, in fact, the person who an officer in a community should be best friends with. Because guess what? He knows who was involved in the fight. He knows who carjacked that old lady. He knows who's the guy really stealing from the liquor store. And instead, Eric Gardner ends up dead on the sidewalk.
Yeah, in a detective novel, he would be the source, right? But in real life, not.
No, exactly. And I just think that's something we need to think about in terms of what we ask of officers, and again, via both our language and the incentive systems of what's expected of them. If an officer shows up to a scene and they know their job is to make an arrest, they're going to make an arrest. In the same way, when I show up to an event and know my job is to come up with a 500-word story, I've got a file tonight. It doesn't really matter that this council meeting was boring and no news happened, right? Like, and we need to think about that in terms of what we're asking police officers to do when they show up, because if they're expected to have a certain outcome, they are going to craft the reality to fit into that outcome. And if that outcome is put the handcuffs on someone, that's what ends up happening.
If I could briefly improve my poor answer after thinking about it while listening to Wesley. There's one thing about the consent decree that they're not going to get fixed, and I think it doesn't, the blame doesn't go to the right people, which is the lack of transparency. And they could improve their systems, and they could improve their internal discipline, and they could improve their training and identify areas of weakness, and it's all secret, and it is not the police department. I think this was referred to earlier. It's not even the police chief or the police department or the local rules. It's the state personnel rules that don't even apply just to police. Those are state personnel rules that apply to all employees.
Right.
And they keep those things secret. And the Maryland General Assembly, every year there's a bill that says, let's open this up. Let's open it up a little bit. And it always fails. And until the General Assembly changes
Even this year in the
that,
Anton Black case, where they said, open up the personnel files, they won't do it.
I mean, there's this misperception that it's on this issue in particular, that it's the Law Enforcement Officers' Bill of Rights. It is state personnel law, and it is not going anywhere. And that's going to prohibit them from being able to demonstrate to the public that they're doing a better job here. And that's the biggest question I have with the consent decree is, how will we know when things have gotten better? What are the benchmarks? How will we know? And I think that as long as these things are secret and a commissioner can't demonstrate what he's doing in a real way, not data. We've seen data. We see reports. Like, show us that you addressed an issue, and they really can't. So sorry, I wanted to jump back.
For example, when the Freddie Gray cops were going on the trial board, right? So the trial board hearings are now open. You can go and see them.
And now nobody has them.
Yeah, right. Interestingly enough, so we were having to try to figure out when they were, because they don't say, X officer on this date in the matter of blah. They put up like a case number.
It's a case number, yeah.
And so we had to kind of guess to know where to be and when, and Rebecca, who does this well?
Well, I work at an organization that we have really tried to take the benefit of learnings abroad. And so much of the work that we're doing around institutional corrections has been informed by countries like Germany and Norway that put human dignity far above any principles of punishment, recognizing that the purpose of somebody going to prison is to right the harm that they've done, but to also try to prevent them from wrongdoing in the future. And that is not, unfortunately, a value that is operating within our criminal justice system, but for very rare examples. And some really progressive governors and State Department corrections leaders who have literally invited us in to start to redesign wings of their prisons that are centered around the idea of human dignity. On the policing front, what was really interesting to me and the conversation about going to an awards dinner and seeing folks who have shot people as the ones who get recognition and attention. I think in policing, it's often in the United States recognized that a good cop is someone who's made a high-profile arrest, primarily, and that they've gotten hurt, often in the pursuit of that ambition. And so we've developed a system in which we're actually motivating people to make arrests and perhaps even to get hurt in that conduct, which is a really backwards way of looking at it, I think. And within most police departments, you have newsletters and digests, and the pictures that are in the captions that are there are of the drug bust and the guns and the celebratory and the praise of that takedown. Where alternatively, and I don't think there are unfortunately a ton of good examples, but where I had the opportunity a couple years ago to spend some time with the equivalent of the Netherlands Anti-Crime Task Force, what they described to me as the underlying philosophy that guides their work is that an arrest is a failure. It means that everything that has been put forth in front of this person and through the department's efforts has failed, and that they do the exact opposite of celebrating those arrests but instead treat them almost like a sentinel event where they're trying to unpack and understand how they can prevent arrests from happening in the future. And until we have departments and more leaders like RaShall who are willing to actually interrogate officers who make lots of arrests, and that is starting to happen in isolation instead of looking at arrest as this performance measure that we want to see high numbers to promote people. Chiefs and executive staff are starting to look at officers who have made a lot of arrests and start to call them in and question their judgment and their training about why they think that those are the sort of ways in which they need to solve problems, and putting people in for additional training and mentoring, recognizing that for many people and in many instances an arrest is going to make their life and the outcome there much worse rather than better.
Right.
One last question before we open up to the audience. Chief, how are you going to know when you have succeeded in changing the culture, in resetting the relationship with the community? How are you measuring this? How are you going to know that you've done what you came to Charlottesville to do?
So one of the metrics will be they're no longer in front of my station saying, honk if you hate the police. I mean, that's probably a start.
Yeah, that would be helpful.
Yeah, you know, in some ways there are things you just kind of know, right? You can almost feel when tensions drop in a room. You can feel when there's this change and there's this difference in ebb and flow. And it's also in the way that we engage and the way the officers engage. And I just want to just think about and talk about what we value in the artifacts and the things that we celebrate. I've changed our entire social media platform, our Facebook, our Twitter, our Instagram. I get to the station and our recruitment poster has our SWAT trucks, the K9 dogs, they're at the firing range. They're like rolling through everything. So I've now changed it. And there's pictures all over our Facebook of me hanging out with the girls and Girl Scout cookies, and I'm in the classroom taking selfies, and you know, our officers are now doing these other things, and there isn't a single picture now of the SWAT trucks and the drug bust and things of that nature, because if we are sending that message, even subliminally, that's what they think we're trying to recruit towards and for. So I also think it's when you know you've succeeded is when your recruitment rates are at an all-time high, where people want to work in your organization, that says we know we're going to be valued in the organization, and the way we're treated here then mimics itself out in the community. And you're absolutely right. Every one of my officers, we talk to them every day. I acknowledge them every day. I talk about how's your family? What does self-care look like? So if you can imagine talking to a SWAT officer who's dripping testosterone, and I'm saying, so talk to me about your self-care. And he's thinking his physical fitness, and I'm talking, no, much deeper than that. I think I'll know when the community is also starting to apply some of that self-care, and they're using us as that conduit forward, and not necessarily antagonistic, and that this is a occupying force that we have to deal with. That when they call 911, knowing you're getting help and not that you're going to be harmed is really that metrics.
Yeah. All right, audience, questions?
Now we can see you.
Yes.
So let me take the first one back here. Yeah, no, I know. This young lady right here, did you not have a question? You did. Oh, sorry. Okay, I'll come back to the front row. There's time for everybody. Yes, sir.
My name is Dwayne Davison. Baltimore Sun knows me very, very well. Politics and politicians. I put a toilet in front of the Towson Courthouse in 2011 to expose the corruption and the racism in the police department and the media's relationship in protecting the corruption. The gun task force, they came to my house in 2010. I turned them in 2010. On February the 2nd, 2011, I blew the whistle on the task force and the corruption that's going on in City Hall.
Sorry, sir. Just, what's your question?
My question is, I've spoken to the Baltimore Sun in your media. You've been at these events over the years with Schellenberger, Bernstein. If you're going after the corruption and the racism, why aren't you going after no white people in Maryland? You ain't going after Schellenberger, Bobby Zirkin, the people that write these laws that get paid. You're not going after the racketeering and the profiting off of the illegal war on drugs. This whole conversation, you talked about violence and you talked about this, but nobody on that panel said, let's end the war on drugs. When you ended prohibition, you ended killing white people. You ended sending white people to jail. You ended the St. Valentine's Day Massacre. But nobody in this conversation has talked about ending the war on drugs, which is the basis of the violence in the community.
All right, very good question. Chief, do you want to maybe take that about your view of how the war on drugs is playing out in this conversation?
Absolutely. You're exactly right. The majority of law enforcement officers were trained in 1990 under the DEA standards of what does it look like to engage a person who was a drug courier. So 35 years in this business, I was given a checklist of what does a person that looks like a drug dealer, what type of car might they be driving, their descriptions and things of that nature. And the interesting thing is, if you don't have someone coming into this profession who's willing to be different, who's willing to be courageous, not in front of a bullet, but in front of a microphone, in front of the public to say that this is an issue, what you get is continued corruption. When we talk about the war on drugs, it was a very intentional, strategic, surgical attempt to disrupt and weaponize law enforcement against black and brown communities. And I stand up in front of most podiums and tell you, I will not be weaponized against any black or brown bodies. I will not be weaponized against those who are coming here legally or even against what our policies are and separate our children. The minute you weaponize law enforcement and use it intentionally to get whatever it is that government's ideas are about what society and who belongs in society, that's when we have the problem. And we haven't said, and we have not apologized as law enforcement or owned the damage that we've done. And I will personally apologize. I've done it in Charlottesville for the damage and the harm that we've done there. In Pittsburgh, the damage and the harm that we did there with Drug Task Force, understanding that the persons who were most likely to be victimized were persons who looked just like myself.
I'm homeless now because of this. I've been homeless since 2011. I've been homeless. I can't get a job. I'm on the terrorist watch list. They charge me with terrorism. Black people don't do terrorism. We shoot people.
Wes, how typical are Chief Brackney's views among law enforcement that you talk to about the war on drugs?
I think they're, I'll say a few things. I think the first is actually think more chiefs and command staff officers share views similar to this, even if they don't feel empowered or that it would be politically wise for them to express them publicly. I do think there's in my reporting experience, a gulf between where a lot of chiefs, commissioners, superintendents, and command staffs are from where many of their line officers are on these issues. I think that we've seen in the last few years the rise of a set of chiefs and commissioners who are more willing to speak with this type of clarity around these issues, although I do think that there is a difficulty because this is a big question. The first question that the incoming commissioner here was asked at his first town hall by our current questioner was, are you willing to end the war on drugs? Because if not, what's the point of all this? And I think that someone might bicker that's an oversimplification, but I do think there's an important, big philosophical question. I think that we have to ask ourselves, what do we want American policing to look like in our communities? And if we were starting from scratch, how would we design it? What would a police officer do? What would be in their toolkit? What would be on their belt? How would we train them? How would they interact? And I do think that there is an increasing willingness to have some of those. And again, what would it look like? There's the commissioner in Houston, Art Acevedo, talks all the time about department consolidation. Should there be 18,000 police departments? Should there be fewer of them? Right? And so there are big questions that I think need to be asked. I think we're asking them more, and they're being asked more in policing than they were 5 years ago. But I certainly don't know that we're all the way there in terms of the entire industry, much less those of us who sit outside of the industry and try to pressure it along. I don't know that we're all completely there yet and asking some of the big questions about what that looks like.
Yeah. I mean, Rebecca and I were talking about this earlier, that vis-a-vis drugs specifically, I think most people agree there are much more effective ways to deal with drugs than arresting people, but arresting people is what we have effectively infinite resources to do, right? You're never in a position where no, I'm sorry, we don't have a jail cell to send this person to. Do we have a
and we'll build another one if we need to, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, we'll build
Well,
it.
I would just add a caveat that it's what we have chosen to dedicate infinite resources to.
Right. Yeah,
And that
precisely.
those are political decisions that need to be really evaluated. And I just want to say, sir, I'm really sorry for what you and many people in your circumstance have gone through. The collateral consequences of arrest are real. And for people who don't understand the reality of drug arrests in particular, over the past several decades, there's been an increase of almost 200% of drug abuse violations in this country. And so while we are seeing arrests decrease in most major categories around this country, that is not the case around drugs. And and what we're seeing most recently is a major, huge increase of women who are being arrested for drug abuse offenses. And this is something that we really need to contend with and understand as more and more people start to recognize and I think fully appreciate the reality that drugs are a public health problem, not a public safety problem. And we have made a decision that police resources are the solution for that problem when that's largely inappropriate. And we need to challenge our cities and our governments to say that, you know, police resources are expensive. Yeah. When we talk about providing alternatives to jail and therapy in contrast to enforcement, what we often hear is that, you know, clinicians, nurses, counselors, social workers are expensive. And there are very few expenses that are as high as policing. Policing is one of the most expensive things in our entire country. Mm-hmm. Policing is more expensive than courts and corrections nationally combined, but it's almost entirely a local expense, and so it's not felt or appreciated or realized at the national level how much is being invested in policing, but the return on investment is not really what I think anybody wants
it's
it to be.
spectacularly ineffective, really.
Yeah, and you know, and the larger than the GDP of many countries.
Yes.
All right, next question.
Thank you. Hi, my name is Shamoya Gardner, and the question for the panel is effectively, when community members don't trust the police force, and in that stead, armed security organizations come into the fold and are not held accountable the same way that police forces are, what are we to do? And for context, I work downtown. Yesterday, I received an email from the Downtown Partnership of Baltimore that came from a private security organization that literally racially profiled a group of Black children, called them predators, said they were scavengers, and assumed that they were explicitly walking around downtown to hurt white people. This is verbatim, and it's spring break in Baltimore.
Could you forward us that email?
Absolutely.
Yeah. Wow, okay. Because that sounds like a story to me. Yeah. Oh, wow. Okay. So can you, perhaps, Chief, you'd be a good person to talk to about the private policing industry these days and how that interacts with these problems we've been talking about.
So I'm just reflecting on the time when I was growing up, and I don't want to date myself too much here, but if I've been in this for 35 years and they did not hire me at 2, I'm probably a little bit over that speed limit. I grew up understanding, and then it was an old police show that said, oh, crime doesn't pay. And I say just the opposite. Everyone is benefiting off of crime out here except the person that is arrested. Everyone makes money off of these things. And it's being driven oftentimes by fear more than anything. When you see private policing entities, it's because someone who's often gentrified is attempting to protect their property, protect their space, and not allow someone else in. Thus the need to then hire those persons who they don't believe they would get the same type of service from the actual policing entity. So they hire an individual who they can have absolute control over, where they don't have any oversight, where there's no accountability, where there's no real way to police them. It's not as though you can go talk to their supervisor. They'll transfer them to another part of the town if they're working for an agency. And because it's really difficult and it's a high turnover profession, it is a profession that is not well regulated at all. I mean, if you think of the challenges around, there are 18,000 policing entities in the United States. Most countries have one policing entity. It's national. And the United States of America is one of the few that has national, i.e. federal, state, local, and then they'll have these sheriffs and parishes and all these other different entities. So what I say is why are we at the point where we believe we have 18,000 different policing agencies out there? And I think it's because in America, we supposedly value this law and order society, but we only value it for certain persons, right? Everyone else can do what they want to do. And if you have enough money, and I hate to say this, the most least prosecuted person is a white blonde female in the United States, because oftentimes the tears of a white woman cause anguish and pain for most other people, and they don't want to police them. So that's, I think, is the challenge that we're currently facing, is why do we feel the need to have the type and level of policing and enforcement throughout the entire nation? And how do we do that in a way that is humane and decent and speaking to the dignity of every human being? And when does forgiveness and grace start and stop? And oftentimes it starts and stops based on who you are, what your socioeconomics look like, what your educational levels are, and what type of access you have to resources.
All right, we probably have time for another couple of questions.
Can I just
Oh, yeah,
say
go right
one
ahead. Go
thing
ahead.
to
Sorry.
that? Without knowing the contours of that, sounds like a really awful communication, very disturbing for you to have received. A lot of times private security companies are being paid through business improvement districts, which, often also
what we're talking about here,
receive, money from your tax base. So if you haven't already, it would probably behoove you to investigate how this private firm is being paid for, and if there is a business improvement district that's involved in that contract at all, that might be one really useful thing to look at.
And I think in a way it's a symptom of the lack of trust in the police department. You see Johns Hopkins University is creating a private police force. They're saying BPD isn't doing enough for us in our area. We want our own force. It's passed. There's neighborhoods that have talked about creating, there's already neighborhoods that have a surcharge and have a private police force, but there's other neighborhoods talking about that. So this sort of feeling that BPD can't be there for us, so we're going to hire a private force that is not accountable, doesn't have the same oversight and rules. It's a genre, yeah.
But the interesting thing is they're hiring not because they're not safe, it's because they don't feel safe. And that's a very different platform as to why we have gated communities. These gated communities aren't experiencing crime, and if you took the gates down, they wouldn't experience crime anyway. It's not those communities when you're having these $2 and $3 million homes. It makes them feel safe versus the fact that they are safe.
Sorry, got a question here in the back.
How you doing? My name is Jordan Holmes. This question is for Dr. Brackney. How much attention is being paid to hiring people of color in communities? Like, if you were to, like you mentioned, you said 70% of the police force was white males. I'm originally from New York, and I see the same thing in Baltimore, that there's a majority white male policing these low-income communities. How come there's not being people pulled from these communities that are being offered positions in the force, or they're known about the opportunities? How can we bridge that gap where there's more people of color policing people in their communities? Because I highly doubt that if you were to go to the suburbs or a lot of rural areas, that there would be people of color policing those neighborhoods.
Thank you for that question, and thank you for being brave enough to ask the question as to why that doesn't occur. I think it's a more complicated issue. First of all, policing tends to be a generational, that you have grandfathers and fathers and their sons get into policing. Growing up in a black community, in a very poor community in Pittsburgh, typically policing was not an option. It was not something that I was even told that I could do. And then now things have shifted, and we have this very, very delicate line that even I walk as a minority individual in law enforcement, right? Whereas I'm called either an Uncle Tom if I'm in those community. I'm enforcing the white man's rules. I mean, there's all of those things that you still have to navigate. And if people don't feel welcomed in a profession, will they likely go towards that profession? The other thing is oftentimes we're competing for those same individuals. If the qualifications are that you have to have a bachelor's degree to enter into it, and I have a young man who has a bachelor's degree, is he going to go into public service like policing, where his entry-level pay may be $40,000 a year, but in private sector he can go and that same, he'll get a $60,000 a year with better benefits, better hours, better retirement. So what we have to do is make the policing profession attractive. And what I say is, I need people in this profession to look like me. It gets kind of lonely being the only black female chief in a room full of oftentimes 99% white males. Because then when I then speak about the issues that concern me, I'm the angry black woman, and it's always that. Or I'm emotional, or I have these histrionics, or I've been hired because I'm an affirmative action hire. And I often tell them, okay, then take my name and my gender off it, and if PhD doesn't get you there, if 35 years doesn't get you there, if doesn't going through an FBI academy, a Secret Service academy, being the first African-American woman who can run a SWAT team in the nation, if those things don't get you there after all these years, then feel free to fire me. So it's those kinds of problems, and then we don't feel comfortable in those spaces. And I have to make it more welcoming, but it can be very lonely and isolating.
All right, we can squeeze in one more if somebody else has a question.
Did I see one up front here? Or, yep. You sure? Okay. All right. I'll come to the gentleman there.
All right, so my name is Alistair Nightfall. I'm currently a student at Morgan State University, which is a HBCU right off of Loch Raven. So my question is, so we say that the majority of the problem is in the Black African American communities. So my thing is, why isn't this conversation, this event, being held, for example, somewhere like a Morgan State University, a Coppin State University? Why is it held here? And we say, the caption is, let's talk Maryland. You look around, you see majority, white people, in this area, and I'm sure, it's because of the institution that they're in. So that's my question. I don't know who's in charge of what's going on.
I don't think any of us can answer that, but
Yeah.
yeah. Well, thank you.
And I would just say, from the Vera Institute of Justice's perspective, if you have a college, if there's a place where you want to organize an event and a conversation like this, we will come, and we want to support those conversations. So please reach out to me if you want to extend a conversation into a different space.
Well, thank you to our audience for coming tonight. Thank you to our panel.
Thank you.
I really
Thank you for
appreciate
having
it.
us.
And Phoebe from Maryland Humanities just has a couple of things for you.
No, I just want to have a big round of applause for all of our folks. Thank you so much. Thank you very much for being here, and I also very much appreciate the audience engagement and questions, and we can talk about selection of venue and those kind of things. I do want to invite you to do two things before you leave. One is to complete the survey and give us your feedback, which we would welcome that and appreciate that. The staff, Maryland Humanities staff, is going to be collecting the surveys as you leave. I'd also ask you to take a moment to connect with Maryland Humanities after today. We are located in Baltimore City, but we serve the whole state. You can visit us online at our website and learn about any of our other 12 programs. You can find us on Facebook, Twitter, all social media, and Instagram at MD Humanities. But we also have real live people who answer the phone in our offices. We'd be very happy to talk to you, or talk to you a little bit tonight, or make an appointment, or to have a cup of coffee. So I want to thank you very much for coming tonight, and thank our esteemed panel again. Thank you.